Thanks. All right, so we'll start with the big picture of MST, what it is, how it works, and then drill down into more details about youth included, more specific elements of the model, and including some focus on the quality assurance system, as well as outcomes of MST. And Tom, I'm going to go ahead and, oh, great. All right, we're totally on the same page now. So big picture, as is shown on the slide here, some really critical elements of MST are captured here. Community-based, family-driven, trauma-informed treatment for antisocial delinquent behavior in youth, all embedded in the context of very structured clinical supervision and QA. As many of you know, you're probably getting some repetition about MST, but the client that we focus on is the entire ecology of the youth and all of the influences of the larger ecology, both on the problems as well as solutions. Treatment is tailored. We'll talk later about the principles of MST that include a focus on this tailoring. So it's tailored to the family's context, culture, religion, norms, and values, with a focus on empowering caregivers to solve problems. With this kind of tailoring and focus on empowering the caregivers, it's combined with, sort of hand in hand, in a principle-driven model. We don't have so much module by module treatment, but principles, research, range of interventions we draw from, so that the treatment process matches specifically what's going on with that family and their context. Very much related and a huge element of the model is that families are seen as the solution. This comes up actually fairly often directly with families in sessions, especially early in treatment. Often, as I'm sure you all have seen, families have the experience or the perception that they're being blamed for their children's problems by people in their community, by service providers. And MST therapists are often ultimately really emphasizing to families, to the caregivers, that rather than them being the problem, that they're the solution. And their influence, their voice, their central role in treatment is critical to helping the youth and the family move forward. And as a part of that, families are full collaborators in the treatment planning and treatment delivery. The other important reason for that sort of close collaboration is with the expectation that families will be able to maintain the changes and handle new challenges as they come up. Related is this point that giving up on families or labeling them as resistant or unmotivated is not an option. We train therapists to avoid use of those words and instead seek to understand through our fit assessment process what the drivers are, if there are barriers to progress or engaging families. As a result of this approach, we have a strong track record and see in the data high levels of client engagement, retention, and satisfaction. So we have a little video. We'll see if it works. If it doesn't work, then I'll just jump right back in. Sometimes tricky to get everything, including the volume, to work through Zoom. So Tom's gonna try to get our video started that will give a bigger picture of MST.
Systemic therapy after he had been arrested for breaking into an empty house with a friend
Tom,
while on his mother's
Tom, can you, the video's not coming up, it's still the slides.
A history of fighting,
okay,
school, and running away from home. Jordan did.
Can you switch what you're sharing? Or no?
let me see. Yeah, this is,
I think if you go from current slide and click on it, that it won't work in the slide sorter view, but I think it will in the slideshow view. the link will work.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yep. Is that not coming through right now?
No.
Okay, I'll go to yeah, this is the slide.
Medication. In addition to drug use, he also had a history of fighting, skipping school.
See, y'all are tantalized by the sound of the volume without being able to see the picture, right?
Right.
Tom, you might have to share a separate screen. Maybe if you click on the link and then share the screen while that video is already up, if that makes sense.
Okay, let me, yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. So I'm going to stop share. And now. Okay, is that coming up now?
Yes, yes, we see video. Great, thank you so much.
15-year-old Jordan was referred to multisystemic therapy after he had been arrested for breaking into an empty house with a friend while high on his mother's prescription pain medication. In addition to drug use, he also had a history of fighting, skipping school, and running away from home. Jordan didn't care what he did or where he would end up. When his mom expressed her concern for him, he always stated that he simply just didn't give up. But more than anything, Jordan's mom feared he would end up incarcerated just like his father, who had been locked up since Jordan was 10 years old. Multisystemic therapy, MST for short, is what saved Jordan from following in his father's footsteps. Here's how. Instead of placing a youth away from home only to release them back into an environment where nothing has changed, MST treats the problem within a youth's natural ecology, their home, school, and community. When a youth starts multisystemic therapy, a key process they will go through with their family and therapist is a fit assessment. The fit, as it is commonly called, is an MST tool that helps understand problematic behaviors by identifying what is driving them. By following the MST fit assessment process, it makes it easier to prioritize which behaviors and drivers to target first, and then properly develop measurable treatment goals. Jordan's most troubling actions usually happened when he had left home, so his family and therapist decided to target that behavior first. His fit circle for running away from home looked something like this. Jordan and mom sometimes fight because mom tells Jordan that she doesn't want him to end up in prison like his dad. Jordan gets upset when his mom says this because he misses his dad and doesn't know how to have a better relationship with his mom. Mom doesn't know where Jordan goes, doesn't know how to find him to get him to come home, lacks skills, and feels hopeless. Mom doesn't know Jordan's peers. Supervision gaps when mom is at work, so Jordan can run away before she gets home. There are no clear expectations, rules, and consequences for Jordan's behaviors. Jordan is not involved in pro-social activities with pro-social peers. After carefully analyzing Jordan's fit circle, the drivers his therapist and the family agreed to prioritize first were: there are no clear expectations, rules, and consequences for Jordan's behaviors. Mom is unsure how to find him and get him to come home, lacks skills, and feels hopeless. Jordan is unsure how to communicate with his mom, so they have conflicts. The goals identified were that 1. Jordan's mother would set clear expectations with matching consequences and rewards. And 2, Jordan would work to communicate with his mother and express his emotions in a healthy way. For Jordan's mom, being the only parent in the house made her feel hopeless. However, the therapist helped her get the confidence she needed to put clear expectations and consequences in place. The first was that Jordan would be allowed to go out with friends, only if he was home on time, and shared his location with her on his phone. If he complied, he would get extra time to spend with friends over the weekend. But if not, his phone service would be turned off. Jordan did not like the sound of this at first, getting defensive and verbally aggressive about having his things taken away. The MST therapist, who was on call at 10 p.m. when the conflict occurred, understood Jordan's frustration because he was not used to having consequences. To Together, the therapist and Jordan's mother explained how we all have consequences for our actions, even adults, and the importance of being held accountable. After an empathetic conversation, Jordan calmed down and realized he needed his phone service on in order to personally call his dad and stay in touch with his friends. So he soon adhered to this. After learning more about Jordan, his therapist noticed his deep love for basketball. She asked why he didn't play on his school's team. And he admitted that he and his dad used to play and talk about it nonstop. But after his dad's arrest, he gave it up. It wasn't easy, but through persistent motivation, Jordan's mother and therapist empowered him to try out for the basketball team, which he ended up making. They then worked with the corrections facility where Jordan's dad was located to get the two of them to start visiting with one another again. First, it was over the phone, then face to face. Because they both shared a love for sports, Jordan began to update his dad after each game, which helped them rebuild a relationship that once seemed impossible to repair. By understanding and treating Jordan's interconnected actions, his behaviors began to improve in all areas. Jordan was not inclined to skip school, now that he had to attend to stay on the basketball team. In addition, he also formed pro-social relationships with his coaches and teammates, who motivated him to try out for football in the fall. Having his phone location always shared with his mom and having regular sports with rewards and consequences down the line. MST works because it considers unique behaviors and the systemic context in which they occur, and it empowers the family and surrounding systems to be agents of change. It is through this empowerment that caregivers learn it is possible to manage their own youth's behaviors and create long-lasting positive transformations. MST, proven results for families and communities.
Thanks so much, Tom. And sorry, folks, about the audio blurriness at the end there. That video creates a nice total picture, and I'll go through more of the slides now to break down some of the details that were captured in the slides. So as Tom pulls back up the slides and the information on slide 5 about who does MST serve, I'll go ahead and start talking about that. This information I think is especially important because for those of you who are familiar with MST, you might notice that we've made some revisions to how we have captured the referral criteria, the inclusionary criteria for MST. This is, I think, a nice example of what is so common in EBPs is the ongoing process of updating and revision based on the realities in the field and out in the world. So currently, the updated framing about appropriate referrals for MST include, you'll see here that they're at risk of severe system consequence due to their serious externalizing, antisocial, and/or delinquent behaviors. This referral criteria used to be at risk of imminent placement. But as we've seen some really nice advances in many systems, placement in the traditional, kids getting locked up especially, is happening less often. But they are still experiencing pretty severe system consequences. So you see those kinds of examples on the right side of this table. It might be out of home placement, but also might be arrest or charges, violation of probation, school expulsion, child welfare involvement. So the range of consequences is broader at this point than just out of home placement. The example behaviors and the kinds of behaviors appropriate for referral to MST, those haven't changed. They've been the same since the model was first developed, with pretty severe, serious externalizing behaviors of some sort, including theft, violence, substance abuse, school problems, and sexual offenses if they're in conjunction with other antisocial behavior. The age range is 12 to 17, but you'll see at the bottom again, another addition is that exceptions for youth a little bit younger or up to age 18 can be requested from the consultant. And again, especially, but both those ages, that expansion is reflective of being responsive to changes in the world and in the systems. So many systems now include youth older than was the case when MST was first designed. So 18-year-olds stay in juvenile justice in many systems. And then unfortunately, we're also seeing an increase in some of these kinds of more serious behaviors in the younger kids, more 10 and 11-year-olds coming into the system because of these kinds of behaviors. In addition to those specific kinds of behaviors and potential system consequences, we've also been clarifying, as you'll see on the next slide, that youth who present for MST might have diagnoses that are more traditionally associated with some of these behavior issues and or ADHD. And we wanted to clarify, as captured on this slide, that if youth have co-occurring needs in conjunction with these antisocial behaviors, they're still very appropriate to refer to MST. That includes trauma-related symptoms, depression, anxiety, as well as mild or moderate intellectual disability or autism spectrum disorder, both needing to be mild or moderate and not severe enough that they're actually the primary driver or contributor to the behavior problems. I want to speak for a moment to trauma-related symptoms, because I know there have been questions about that, including for the last presenter. We will address trauma-related symptoms within MST, whether or not it's full PTSD. And like Andrea described previously, we draw from TF-CBT to inform and design interventions to address trauma-related symptoms. It would not be expected that a youth who's referred to MST is referred primarily because of trauma-related symptoms, but as we discussed in the prior slide, because of their acting out behaviors. And similar to what Andrea talked about with, now I just, too many acronyms in my head, PCIT, we focus first on the behaviors as is suggested in guidance from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, that when youth are presenting first with behavioral issues, that would be the primary focus. And then if through that kind of fit assessment referenced in the video, we are seeing evidence that trauma-related symptoms are significant drivers of the behaviors that the youth is presenting with, then we would draw from TF-CBT interventions to address those trauma-related symptoms. Another specific area I wanted to speak to on the next slide is that treatment is tailored to families from diverse cultures. So youth may be referred to MST from different cultures, different races, different ethnic groups. And one important element of the tailoring process that I referenced before is to tailor to the culture and the context of the family. Listed here are the guidelines we give MST teams to support that tailoring, including working to develop a workforce, an MST team that matches the demographic characteristics of the community served. So the therapists are bringing to the team knowledge, experience, and relationships in the different cultural groups in the community. As much as possible, hiring and assigning therapists who speak the same language as primary caregivers, and then always seeking to understand each family's values and cultural context with respect and humility. And over time, accessing community leaders to learn about cultural practices, so the therapists start out with a good knowledge base and being well informed. And then the therapist, the supervisor and the expert providing therapists with training and ongoing feedback on their work with families from diverse cultures. So that's the picture of who's included and appropriate for MST. Then there are some situations in which youth are not appropriate for MST, and that's youth who are living independently. And this is next slide, please, Tom. Because they're not in the family context with which MST is designed to work. Youth who engage in sex offending in the absence of other antisocial behavior, moderate to severe autism, or severely or profoundly intellectually impaired. As I was referencing before, in those cases, the other issues, the other needs the youth are presenting with are likely to be primary drivers of problem behaviors. If youth are actively homicidal, suicidal, or psychotic, they're not appropriate. And if their psychiatric problems are a primary reason leading to referral, or they have severe or serious psychiatric problems, regular MST is not designed to address those kinds of needs. Now shifting to the model itself and the theory and elements of the model. I've referenced the ecological context of the youth a number of times. The social ecological theory of Bronfenbrenner is very much a foundation of MST, based in these concepts that children, adolescents live in a social ecology of interconnected systems that impact their behavior directly and indirectly, and the influences are bidirectional. I love this schematic, the social ecological model that's next. I think a lot of models use this schematic in some form. As we train therapists, we often emphasize the fact that there are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels between the child and the provider agency, to emphasize the fact that the most influential parts of the ecology around the youth are the family and caregivers and peers, neighborhood, school, that world in which the youth is embedded. So as you'll see in the next slide, we also see from the research that those are the primary predictors of delinquent behavior are those same ecological contexts, the peers, family, school, the neighborhood and community context. So the MST model and the theory of change upon which the model is based addresses those various elements of the ecology. Primarily, and next slide, please, Tom. Primarily, the therapist is working with the family, working on improving the family functioning. So the family and with the caregivers in the lead are the ones addressing peers, school, and community, addressing where there are problems there, leveraging the strengths, building strengths, all going to that ultimate goal of reduced antisocial behavior and improved functioning. So that's the theoretical foundation. And then as we move into what happens in the model, some of the assumptions underlying what happens in the model is, very much drawing from that socio-ecological model of the influence of families, friends, and communities on the child's behavior, which leads to families and communities being essential partners and collaborators in MST treatment. And we base the work in this assumption that caregivers and parents want the best for their children and want them to grow to become productive adults, even though at times it can seem like parents or caregivers aren't engaged, aren't invested in the ways that sometimes the therapists expect. We work with the therapist to help them keep grounding back in this belief that they really want the best for their children. Another set of assumptions include that families can live successfully without formal mandated services. This is an area that sometimes is a complicated one to negotiate in a service system, especially with hand in hand the assumption that change can occur quickly. And you'll see a little bit later that the average duration of treatment in MST is about 4 months. The idea that within 4 months, a family can develop the skills, the strategies, the supports to be able to move towards not having as much formal or mandated services in their life is a bit counter to some of the norms that have evolved in our service system and in our world. So the teams are often actively working with other providers, with other services in the community to try to bring to life this assumption and build alignment and plans with other service providers to help the family move to this place of independence without as many formal services. In order to achieve that sort of quick change and empower the families, the treatment providers, and this is very much the expectation for the MST team, we expect that they're accountable for achieving the outcomes. They're accountable for overcoming barriers, which goes back to the idea that we don't call families resistant or unmotivated. We say, okay, what's the barrier? And I, as the therapist, am going to figure out what's the fit of the barrier and what can I do to overcome it and achieve the outcomes of helping this youth change those behaviors. And the last assumption is that science and research provide valuable guidance to inform the treatment process. And you'll see on the next slide that intervention strategies that MST draws from include these research-based treatment techniques: behavior therapy, parent management training, cognitive behavioral therapy, pragmatic family therapies, and then pharmacological interventions where the research points to them, for example, for ADHD. All right, so now I'm going to drill down even further to core elements of the MST treatment model, looking at the principles, the analytic process, and the quality assurance system. There are 9 principles of MST intervention design and implementation we'll look at in a moment. And we'll also look at and talk about our measures of treatment fidelity and adherence. And at the family level, that measure is related to these 9 principles. So the 9 principles, that number 1 is finding the fit. And you all saw the example fit circle in the video a little while ago. Number 2, I really want to emphasize, I think it's been coming through in some of the things I've talked about. I just want to really overtly label this principle of being positive and strength focused. That translates into the therapist using good clinical skills, good engagement skills to be positive with the family, supportive. And the strength focus is a very rich element of the model. It's not just about being positive and reinforcing, it's about actively, regularly identifying and leveraging the strengths in the system, the youth strengths, the caregiver strengths, the community strengths, the school strengths, and building on what's already there, rather than trying to create from scratch new skills or resources. As much as possible, the therapist is really looking for what are the strengths that are already present in order to, 1, tailor to what's important to that family, what's available to them, what's in their system, and 2, to be efficient, because it's a lot faster to leverage what's there than it is to create things from scratch. So I really wanted to emphasize these first 2 principles as critical to the model. The others are also very critical, and I'm just going to highlight a couple. 5 targeting sequences. Assessing a sequence is an important element of understanding the full fit and identifying places in the sequence, such as the conflict we saw in the video, conflict between the youth and mom. The therapist would work with the family to say, let's talk through the sequence. What's that conflict look like step by step by step? And then let's figure out where is the earliest point in the sequence we can intervene to avoid the conflict, or perhaps keep it from escalating if it gets started. And then I want to just go back to principle number 8, the evaluation and accountability, and again, punctuate the point that we're constantly evaluating in the course of treatment what's working, what's not working, and the therapist and the team hold that accountability for figuring out what could work with the family. And just a high-level overview of quality assurance and continuous quality improvement in MST. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Tom. I missed the analytic process in my printout here. So we call this the do loop also. It's not rocket science. It's basically the scientific method applied to the treatment process, starting from referral behaviors and understanding the desired outcomes, what family and other key participants want, to inform overarching goals. And I want to point to that environment of alignment and engagement of family and key participants. That is the background. It's that that like wallpaper, that wall upon which everything else is based. And I want to just expand on these couple references to key participants, which goes back to a point from early in the slides about working closely with other agencies. The treatment process, in order to be effective and help the youth in their full ecology, needs to draw on and incorporate the input and the active participation of key participants. That might be extended family or neighbors, for example, who are going to monitor the youth while a parent is working late. Or a key participant might be a probation officer who has good information about the youth or the community or places the youth shouldn't be hanging out, as well as a probation officer needs to inform the goals and measurement to make sure everybody knows what's sufficient progress or what's not sufficient in the eyes of the probation officer. Those are just some examples of ways that key participants are involved in the treatment process. And I just wanted to highlight what essential collaborators they are in treatment. After the goals are set, sorry, Tom, I was just at the top of the do loop. I'm gonna go down through the rest of it. So after the goals are set, the therapist works with the family and key participants on the kind of fit you saw in the video, prioritizes the drivers on the fit. Again, as you saw, those 3 drivers were prioritized related to discipline, monitoring, and family conflict. Goals are set to address those areas, specific interventions developed, implemented, and then here's the measurement that we talked about a moment ago with the principles, where assessment of advances and barriers occurs, reevaluation, and then we go back through the whole loop as needed until the goals are met. Thanks, Tom. Now I'm ready for the next slide. And the QA and CQI. This is a complex process we just talked through with families and youth who often have a lot of challenges in their environment, maybe multiple problems, multiple system involvement, perhaps over generations. In order to help the teams and the therapists get to these positive outcomes for the youth and their families, we have a pretty intensive QA and QI process involving training and ongoing support. So initial training and then ongoing training and support. Organizational support and guidelines for that we'll talk about in a couple of moments to ensure that the teams have what they need to be successful. Monitoring of implementation via adherence measures, tracking of outcomes, and work sample reviews. And then using that monitoring and that data to improve implementation as needed. I want to drill down into a couple specific pieces of the QA and CQI processes. First, the MST staff training. Again, we emphasize and keep going back to what's the purpose, what's our overall goal, and it's to achieve these positive outcomes. And there are pretty detailed training and supervision protocols used that come from the clinical trials of MST, including our 5-day orientation training, which currently is 6 days in the virtual format, so people don't go crazy on Zoom. A lot of on-the-job training, that's a core element of this training process, with weekly on-site supervision from the team supervisor, and then an MST expert who's usually removed from the provider and the team, also providing weekly case reviews, quarterly on-site booster training from the expert, and then ongoing development planning for all professionals. Another important element of the CQI system are the research-based adherence measures. I referenced the TAM a while ago, which is referencing the 9 principles we talked about. Those are completed by the family. The SAM, I'm going to explain these and then go back to the research. The SAM is a measure the therapist complete about the supervisor and how well the supervisor is adhering to the supervisory protocols. And then the CAM is a measure that the team, therapists and supervisors, complete on the work of the consultant and MST expert and how well they're adhering to their protocols. And each type of adherence measure has been associated with improved outcomes for families, as you can see here. And it's kind of amazing that the consultant adherence measure, a person who's a couple steps removed from the youth and family, that actually predicts improved youth outcomes. And the next slide is a schematic that shows how these pieces fit together. Starting on the right with the youth and family, and then the therapist having that direct impact and work with the family, the supervisor working with the therapist, all in that broader organizational context. The expert usually outside the organizational context, and then the expert has a coach within MST services. And down on the bottom, you see how each adherence measure flows down from the person filling it out, and then the output goes back to the person about whom the adherence measure is completed. So in looking at these critical elements we've been talking about of MST, the continuous focus on outcomes, fidelity, and accessibility of treatment, we haven't talked about very much yet, or sustainable funding strategies. So we'll drill into those a little bit more now as we look at what influences these critical elements of MST, with a healthy start from the beginning, collaboration, support, and some specific operational practices. So here we have the stages of program development designed to support a healthy start for a new team. And I'll just give you a second to scan these elements of a healthy start and program development. So those of you on the call who aren't current providers, but are interested in becoming providers, you just get a snapshot of what those stages look like. Next, the slide shows the information about the fees that cover from program development into the start of a team with licensure, and the support fees for the expert consultant and the various types of training they provide that was listed previously. The first year has higher fees because of the program development process, and then in subsequent years, the fee is lower. This is for one MST team. If a provider agency has multiple teams, then the fees are going to be a little bit lower because of efficiencies with more teams. Once you get into the program development process and after the program development process, interagency collaboration is a critical element of the process. Clearly defining the target population, as we talked about very early in the slides here, the program goals referral process is really critical. Any of you who are involved currently in MST teams know there are a whole lot of challenges that can arise in having a smooth referral process and sufficient referrals to a team. Funding structure, collaboration between the provider and funders is very critical, as well as the ability of the therapist to take the lead in clinical decision-making. Key stakeholders are listed here. These are some of the common key groups involved in this kind of interagency collaboration. Next, moving to the provider level, there are specific actions and elements of the work by the provider that we have learned over time are really critical to the success of the program. Again, this issue of targeting MST compatible, MST appropriate populations, that the provider organization has a clear understanding of MST at all levels, so that staff at the various levels are understand enough to be supportive of the MST program and to provide the things that are needed, from commitment to implementing it fully to this willingness to modify policies and dedicate resources to achieve outcomes. Given the design of the model, things such as flex time and on-call procedure, making sure the staff can drive to and from families, have the resources, sufficient salary for very intense work and flexible hours, and of course, cell phones. Everybody needs cell phones now. So the support of the provider to ensure all these resources are in place is really critical. Concretely, what does the team look like? It's a team of 2 to 4 therapists plus a supervisor. The expectation is that the staff are specifically dedicated to MST. A single therapist carries a caseload of 4 to 6 families at a time. The supervisor needs to have credible authority and be committed and have sufficient allocation to do the various tasks of training and support and field visits, etc. And we recommend full-time whenever possible, which might include that the supervisor carries some cases. And we also recommend MST training for all staff in the provider agency who can influence treatment. As referenced throughout the presentation today, the work's done on-site in the community, home, school, neighborhood, and with flexible scheduling to remove barriers to service access by families who often really need that kind of flexibility. As referenced a moment ago, the therapists have low caseloads, 3 to 5 months with 4-month average length of treatment. And at the provider level, operationally, there is this support of adherence to all the QA protocols, on-call coverage, and the use of outcome-based discharge criteria, as opposed to, for example, time-based criteria. And as a result of all of these elements of MST, we see really positive real-world outcomes, which this slide captures from the MSTI 2020 annual report. There is a centralized database that all teams use to track information, including these outcomes for families. And so you see 92% of youth from around the world, about 14,000 cases through all of 2019, 92% at home, 87% in school, and 89% with no arrests. And when we look at long-term data from the clinical trials, we see similar kinds of outcomes at 14 years, fewer arrests, fewer violent arrests, fewer days in adult commitment, and time on probation. And even very long term at 22 years, we see similar kinds of positive outcomes for youth who received MST compared to treatment as usual. And then our final summary here, why is MST successful, just comes full circle. We start with the research, the known causes of delinquency, and address them in the treatment. It's family driven, occurs in the youth's natural environment and ecology. There's a lot of energy devoted to also connecting to other agencies who are involved, strong training and support, accountability, and CQI at all levels. So that is the end. And now I will answer questions.
So first question, is MST time limited or does it stop at a certain time point?
There is the goal of 3 to 5 months, depending on the needs. It's very need driven. So there aren't a lot of straight up formulas in MST. There are a lot of it depends answers. The treatment is designed to be this shorter term, and the therapist is trained and coached along the way to engage in intensive work from the beginning to facilitate that process of quick change, and to be really mindful and attentive to sustainability planning from the beginning, and building those supports with the natural network in their environment, so that within that average of 4 months, the goals are achieved with enough sustainability, the support networks and the skills are in place so that the expectation is that within that 3 to 5 months, the family is ready and empowered to start tackling things on their own. If there's a need for whatever reason, such as something has changed in the ecology, case by case decisions might be made to extend treatment. So there's a lot of really the decisions being based on the specifics of that family.
And what does MST working with the school look like?
Right now or before? Right now, well, it's been looking like a lot of Zoom calls and emails. It's going to depend again on the youth. So let's say, for example, we have a situation in which the youth isn't attending school, is regularly truant. Then the focus is going to be, what's the fit of the truancy? What are the drivers related to the school, strengths related to the school that could be leveraged? So maybe there needs to be improvement in communication from school to home so the caregivers know the youth hasn't attended. So the therapist would facilitate development of communication, maybe identify who at the school is the right person, prep the parent, support the parent to have the conversations with that person and establish the communication. Odds are there might be a glitch early on in that communication process. So then the therapist would support the family in working with the school to smooth out any of the glitches that occur. If the youth is struggling more in the classroom with behaviors, then the coordination, collaboration would maybe be more with the teachers and trying to understand what's the sequence leading to the behavior problems. So there's going to be the assessment with the teachers and then building of plans for intervention with the teachers. And again, probably communication home to the parent. And we often see that relationships between the parents and the school have gotten really bad. So another point of intervention in the very beginning might be to work to repair that relationship, to prep for meetings with the school, with the parent, and then bring them together based on that prep to increase the likelihood of a positive interaction. that give enough of a picture? I know it's not comprehensive, they're snapshots.
I think it absolutely does. Thank you. And our next question, what is the licensing requirement for an MST provider? Can you be under supervision or do you have to be a fully licensed therapist?
So I will say there's a state requirement here that's not an MST model requirement, but the state requirement in Virginia is for licensure. Oh gosh, I shouldn't have this fully memorized by now because we've had so many discussions. I'm just getting torn between the master's level and licensure, but I think it's, yes, it's licensure, and with very specific requirements about which, what level of qualification of staff, with an exception for one person. And now I just can't remember if it's unlicensed or lower level of licensure. So if the person who asked that wants the specific details, they can email the email addresses at the end, and I'll pull up that detail of what the one staff exception is.
Okay. And Lisa and Tom, if you have a slide that has your contact information, could you keep that up so folks can take a note of that if they'd like to?
Yeah, thanks. That's the last slide, Tom. Any other questions?
If anyone has any more questions, feel free to put them down into the chat.
Thanks, Tom. MST has been around the state a while.